At 11:47 a.m. on March 14, 1945, Private First Class Vincent Torelli crouched in a flooded foxhole on Luzon's eastern ridge, watching 32 Japanese soldiers advance through the bamboo thicket 200 yards downslope. His rifle held 8 rounds. His closest reinforcement was 400 yards behind him, pinned down by machine gun fire. In the next 90 seconds, Torelli would kill 7 men with a single thrust of a weapon that didn't exist in any U.S. Army manual, proving that the deadliest innovations in war don't come from engineers in Maryland, but from dock workers in Brooklyn, who understand that sometimes you need to make a hole big enough that nothing gets back up. The modification violated 3 separate sections of the Army's field manual on weapons maintenance. It would have gotten him court-martialed if anyone in command had seen it before that afternoon. But by sunset, 12 other men in Baker Company would be building their own versions in the mud, and by the end of the week, a Japanese patrol would report encountering Americans using unknown spear weapons of unusual penetrating capability. Nobody at Fort Benning ever taught what Torelli did with that bayonet. They taught blade maintenance, proper thrust angles, parry techniques. They taught you to stab once, withdraw, stab again. They never taught you what happens when you reshape the weapon itself into something the human body can't stop, even if it wants to. Torelli was 23 years old. He'd grown up on the Brooklyn waterfront, where his father worked the loading docks at Pier 47. His earliest memories involved the smell of creosote, the sound of cargo hooks scraping against hulls, and watching longshoremen use pike poles to shift 800-pound crates that shouldn't have been movable by hand. The poles had a specific taper, a specific point geometry. Too blunt, and they'd slide off the crate. Too sharp, and they'd stick, couldn't be pulled free. The men who'd been doing it for 30 years knew the exact angle that would punch through wood, find purchase, then release when you needed it to. When Torelli joined up in October 1943, he brought that knowledge with him. Not consciously, just in his hands, in the way he looked at tools and thought about force and friction. Basic training at Camp Wheeler, Georgia. They issued him an M1 Garand with a standard M1905 bayonet, 16 inches of steel with a 10-inch blade. The blade had a triangular cross-section designed to puncture and withdraw cleanly. It worked fine on the straw dummies. It worked fine on the watermelon demonstrations. It worked fine until Torelli got to Luzon in January 1945 and discovered that Japanese soldiers didn't collapse like straw dummies when you stuck them. The problem revealed itself slowly. Baker Company, 120th Infantry Regiment, 32nd Division. They'd been island hopping since New Guinea. By the time they hit Luzon, most of the original company was dead or rotated home. The replacements were kids from the draft, farm boys from Iowa and Wisconsin who'd never been in a real fight. Torelli wasn't original company either, but he'd seen enough action on Lady to know what worked and what didn't. What didn't work was the bayonet doctrine they'd learned at Camp Wheeler. First man Torelli saw go down from it was Private Eddie Kowalski from Milwaukee. February 3rd, 1945, jungle clearing 8 miles east of San Jose. Japanese counterattack at dawn, hand-to-hand in the fog. Kowalski did everything right. Textbook thrust, got his blade into a Japanese soldier's chest, right where the manual said to aim. The problem was the blade stuck. Caught on a rib, wouldn't pull free. Kowalski tried to yank it out, lost 3 seconds, and a second Japanese soldier shot him in the throat from 6 feet away. Torelli was 10 yards away when it happened. Saw the whole thing. Saw Kowalski standing there pulling on his rifle like he was trying to start a stubborn lawnmower. Saw the muzzle flash. Saw Kowalski drop. The medic couldn't do anything. Kowalski bled out in 40 seconds. After the skirmish ended, Torelli went over and looked at Kowalski's rifle. The bayonet was still embedded in the dead Japanese soldier's ribcage. It took 2 men and a boot on the corpse's chest to pull it free. The blade had punched through the sternum at an angle, caught on the back of a rib, and wedged itself so thoroughly that the steel had actually bent slightly when Kowalski tried to extract it. That was February 3rd. February 11th, Private Lucas Hayes from Des Moines. Same problem, different angle. Hayes bayoneted a Japanese soldier during a trench raid, got his blade stuck in the man's shoulder blade. Couldn't pull it free, couldn't defend himself. A Japanese officer shot him twice in the stomach. Hayes lived long enough to make it back to the aid station, died during surgery. February 19th, Corporal James Sullivan from Omaha bayoneted a Japanese soldier in the abdomen. Blade went in clean but caught on something internal. Intestines or spine, nobody was sure. Sullivan abandoned the rifle entirely, drew his pistol, shot the next 2 Japanese soldiers who came at him. He survived, but his rifle stayed stuck in that corpse for the rest of the battle. When they recovered it, 3 hours later, the bayonet had rusted into place. They had to hacksaw it off. Sullivan stopped carrying a bayonet after that, just taped a Ka bar knife to his belt, and said he'd rather have something he could pull free. Torelli started paying attention, started asking questions. Found out this wasn't new, wasn't unique to Baker Company. Guys from Able Company had the same complaints. Dog Company, Fox Company. Everyone who'd been in close combat knew the bayonet worked great until it didn't. And when it didn't, you died. The after-action reports never mentioned it. Officers wrote things like, Private Hayes killed in action during close engagement, and Private Kowalski died of wounds sustained in combat. Nobody wrote, killed because his bayonet got stuck and he couldn't defend himself. That would have implied a problem with Army equipment, and Army equipment didn't have problems. If equipment failed, it was operator error, user malfunction. Should have thrust at a different angle, should have pulled harder, should have been faster. By early March, Baker Company had a 41% casualty rate in any engagement that went hand to hand. The numbers were there in the medical reports, if anyone cared to calculate them, but nobody did. Close combat was supposed to be rare, supposed to be a last resort. The fact that it kept happening, kept shredding rifle companies across Luzon, that was just the nature of Pacific warfare. Japanese soldiers didn't surrender. They charged. They fought to the last man. You couldn't doctrine your way around that. You just fed more replacements into the grinder and hoped enough of them survived to take the next ridge. Torelli watched it happen. Watched kids who'd been in country for 2 weeks get torn apart because they'd been trained to use a weapon that worked beautifully in Georgia and killed them in the Philippines. He wasn't angry about it exactly. Anger required the belief that someone could fix it, that someone higher up cared enough to try. Torelli had been in long enough to know that the distance between a private's foxhole and the War Department in Washington was measured in light years, not miles. But he kept thinking about those pike poles on Pier 47, kept thinking about the geometry. The M1905 bayonet had a blade designed to slip between ribs, to puncture organs, to withdraw cleanly so you could stab the next man. The problem was that human anatomy didn't cooperate. Ribs moved, bones were hard, tissue grabbed steel and didn't let go, especially if the steel had any kind of burr or roughness on it. The triangular cross-section that was supposed to make extraction easier actually made it worse, because once the blade twisted, even slightly, the angles caught on everything. What you needed wasn't a blade that slipped in. What you needed was a blade that punched through. Not around the bones, through them. A blade that treated the human body like a longshoreman treated a wooden crate. Something to be penetrated so completely that there was nothing left to catch on. Torelli thought about this for 2 weeks. Didn't talk about it, didn't mention it to anyone. Just thought about angles and force and what happened when you changed the geometry of a point. On March 9, 1945, Baker Company took a ridge 3 miles east of their previous position. They dug in for the night. Standard procedure, foxholes every 30 feet, 2 men per hole, 1 awake at all times. Torelli pulled first watch, midnight to 2 a.m. His foxhole partner, a replacement kid named Danny Alvarez from El Paso, fell asleep immediately. Torelli sat in the dark and listened to the jungle. Insects, night birds, the occasional rustle that might have been a monkey, or might have been a Japanese patrol. His rifle was across his knees. The bayonet was fixed to the muzzle, regulation style. He'd cleaned it that afternoon, worked oil into the steel, checked for any burrs or damage. At 12:40 a.m., he made a decision. He took the bayonet off the rifle, set it on the dirt beside him, pulled out his whetstone and his maintenance kit. The whetstone was Army issue, fine grit, designed for keeping edges sharp, but not for major reshaping. What Torelli wanted to do required major reshaping. The standard M1905 bayonet point had a symmetrical taper, all 3 edges converging at roughly the same angle. It was designed to spread tissue apart as it entered, creating a channel that the blade could follow. Torelli wanted the opposite. He wanted a point that didn't spread tissue, that compressed it, that created a hole so catastrophic that there was nothing left to grab onto. He started working on the primary edge. Long, steady strokes, removing steel at a steep angle. The whetstone made a soft scraping sound. He worked slowly, checking the geometry every few passes. Alvarez snored softly beside him. The jungle hummed. What he was creating was closer to a pyramid than a triangle. The point became narrower, steeper, more aggressive. Instead of 3 edges converging at 120 degrees, he was making them converge at angles closer to 90 degrees, on 2 faces, and maybe 140 on the 3rd. It wasn't symmetrical. It wasn't pretty. It looked wrong, actually. Looked like someone had tried to sharpen a bayonet and screwed it up. But the geometry was right. Torelli knew it in his hands, the same way he knew when a pike pole would punch through wood. It wasn't about the blade being sharper. It was about the blade concentrating force into a smaller area, creating a wedge effect that would split bone instead of skating off it. He worked until 1:20 a.m. His fingers hurt. The whetstone was warm from friction. He'd removed maybe 1/8 of an inch of steel total, but the shape of the point had changed completely. Where it had been a gradual taper, now it was almost harsh. An aggressive transition from blade to point that looked brutal and unfinished. He tested it against the side of his foxhole, pressed it into the packed dirt. The original bayonet, would have required significant force to penetrate more than an inch. This modified point sank in with almost no resistance, the steep angles cutting through the soil like it wasn't there. Torelli cleaned the blade, put it back on his rifle, settled in to finish his watch. He didn't tell Alvarez what he'd done, didn't mention it to anyone the next day. Just carried his rifle with the modified bayonet and waited to see if the geometry would hold up to something harder than dirt. On March 11th, Baker Company pushed east again. Light contact, couple of snipers, nothing serious. Torelli didn't fire a shot. On March 12th, more of the same. The Japanese were pulling back, consolidating on defensive positions closer to the Zhujiaji Mountains. On March 13th, they took a village that wasn't on any map, just a cluster of burned-out buildings and a well. Found evidence of a Japanese supply dump, recent footprints heading northeast. The captain decided to hold position overnight, send out patrols in the morning. That night, Torelli pulled the same modification on Alvarez's bayonet. Alvarez asked what he was doing. Torelli said he was sharpening it. Alvarez said it looked weird. Torelli said to trust him. On the morning of March 14th at 6:15 a.m., Baker Company sent out 3 patrols. Torelli was on the eastern patrol, 8 men, orders to scout 2 miles out and report back by noon. Sergeant Marcus led. Good man, 30 years old, had been at Guadalcanal. They found Japanese positions at 9:30 a.m. Bunkers, fighting positions. Maybe a platoon's worth of enemy soldiers dug in on a ridge overlooking a river crossing. Marcus radioed it in. Captain's orders: observe and withdraw. Artillery would handle it. But at 10:20 a.m., a Japanese patrol stumbled into the American position from behind. 12 men, maybe 15. Someone fired. Both sides went to ground. The American patrol was cut off, Japanese between them and friendly lines. More Japanese on the ridge ahead. Marcus tried to maneuver, but the jungle was too thick. They ended up in a running firefight, falling back through the bamboo, trying to break contact. At 11:35 a.m., Torelli got separated from the main group. He could hear Alvarez somewhere to his left, could hear Marcus shouting orders maybe 60 yards ahead. But he was alone, moving through shoulder-high ferns, trying to get to higher ground where he could see what was happening. At 11:42 a.m., he found a position. A small ridge, flooded foxhole at the top, probably dug by the Japanese weeks earlier. He crawled in, checked his ammunition. 8 rounds in the rifle, 2 magazines for his pistol, 1 grenade. At 11:47 a.m. he saw them, 32 Japanese soldiers, moving in a loose skirmish line through the bamboo below him. They were advancing toward where he'd last heard Marcus and the others. They hadn't seen Torelli. He was above them, maybe 200 yards out, concealed by the ridge and the vegetation. Torelli had a choice. He could stay quiet, let them pass, hope they didn't spot him. He could fire from concealment, maybe get 3 or 4 before they zeroed in on his position and killed him. Or he could radio Marcus, warn him. But the Japanese would hear the transmission and know Americans were close. He did the math. 8 rounds, 32 targets. Even if he was perfect, even if every shot killed, he'd run dry before he made a meaningful dent in their numbers. And he wouldn't be perfect. Nobody was. Behind him, maybe 400 yards back, he could hear American voices. The rest of the patrol, probably pinned down by the Japanese unit that had jumped them earlier. If these 32 soldiers got past Torelli's position, they'd flank Marcus, catch the patrol in a crossfire, wipe them out. Torelli made a choice. He climbed out of the foxhole, fixed his bayonet. The modified point caught the light differently than it used to, the angles sharper, more defined. He moved downslope, staying low, using the bamboo for cover. The Japanese soldiers were maybe 150 yards away now, still advancing, still focused on the terrain ahead. At 120 yards, Torelli picked his route. There was a depression in the ground, an old streamed, mostly dry except for a few inches of stagnant water. It ran perpendicular to the Japanese line of advance. If he could get into it unseen, he could move along it, get close. At 100 yards, he dropped into the stream bed. The water was warm, smelled like rot. He moved in a crouch, rifle held across his chest, bayonet forward. The stream bed curved slightly, bringing him closer to the Japanese flank. At 60 yards, one of them saw him. Torelli didn't hesitate. He broke into a run, closing the distance. The Japanese soldier who'd spotted him raised his rifle, shouted something. The men nearest to him turned. Torelli fired once, hit the shouter in the chest, kept running. 40 yards, 30, 20. The Japanese line was collapsing inward, soldiers turning toward the threat, trying to bring weapons to bear. Someone fired, bullets snapped past Torelli's head. He fired again, dropped another soldier, worked the bolt without breaking stride. 10 yards, 5. The first Japanese soldier to reach him was a kid, maybe 19, bayonet fixed, coming in with a textbook thrust aimed at Torelli's chest. Torelli batted it aside with his rifle, stepped inside the kid's reach, and drove his modified bayonet up under the rib cage. The blade punched through, didn't slow down, didn't catch. Went in like the kid's body was water, not flesh. Torelli felt the point hit spine, felt it crack through, felt the blade emerge from the kid's back. He yanked it free. Took maybe a second, maybe less. The blade came out clean, no resistance, no sticking. The kid dropped. A second soldier lunged at him from the right. Torelli pivoted, brought his rifle around, drove the bayonet into the man's throat. Same result. The modified point punched through windpipe, through vertebrae, through the back of the neck. Torelli pulled it free. The soldier collapsed, blood spraying from the exit wound. A third soldier fired point blank, missed. Torelli shot him in the face, worked the bolt, stabbed the next man who came at him. The bayonet went in just below the sternum, angled up, found the heart. The soldier tried to grab the rifle, couldn't. Torelli pulled the blade free, kicked the corpse away. 4 men down in maybe 8 seconds. The rest of the Japanese soldiers were trying to form a defensive line, but they were too close, too compressed. Torelli was inside their effective range, moving too fast for them to track with rifles. 2 more came at him with bayonets. He shot the first, stabbed the second. The blade went in through the man's chest, found a rib, and the rib shattered. The point kept going, punched out the back. Torelli yanked it free. 6 men down. A Japanese officer with a sword tried to cut him. Torelli blocked with his rifle, felt the sword bite into the woodstock, twisted the rifle, and drove his bayonet into the officer's armpit. The point went through the shoulder joint, through muscle, scraped against bone, and kept going. The officer screamed. Torelli pulled the blade free, shot a soldier who was aiming at him from 10 feet away. 8 men down, rifle empty. Torelli dropped the rifle, drew his pistol, shot the next soldier who came at him, and the next, and the next. The Japanese line was breaking, soldiers scattering into the jungle. Some were running, some were trying to regroup. A few were still advancing, still fighting. One of them stabbed Torelli in the left shoulder. The bayonet went in maybe 2 inches, scraped off his shoulder blade, pulled free. Torelli shot the man twice, center mass, turned and shot another soldier who was raising his rifle. The slide locked back, pistol empty. Torelli picked up his rifle. No time to reload. A Japanese soldier charged him. Torelli met the charge, drove his bayonet into the man's sternum. The point hit bone, cracked through, penetrated the chest cavity. Torelli felt the blade punch through the back of the rib cage, felt it emerge on the other side. He yanked it free, swung the rifle like a club, hit another soldier in the head with the stock. The Japanese line collapsed. Soldiers were running, abandoning positions, disappearing into the bamboo. Torelli stood in the stream bed, breathing hard, covered in blood that wasn't his, except for the wound in his shoulder. Around him, 11 Japanese soldiers lay dead or dying. The rest were gone. He counted his kills. 7 had died on his bayonet, 4 from gunfire, 11 total out of 32. The other 21 had broken and run. Torelli reloaded his rifle, reloaded his pistol, sat down in the stream bed and waited for his hands to stop shaking. At 12:03 p.m., Marcus found him. The sergeant looked at the bodies, looked at Torelli, didn't say anything for a long moment. "You all right?" Marcus asked finally. "Got stabbed," Torelli said. He showed Marcus the shoulder wound. It was bleeding, but not bad. More of a deep cut than a penetration. Marcus looked at the Japanese corpses again. "You do all this?" "They were heading for your position," Torelli said. "Couldn't let them flank you." Marcus counted the bodies. "Jesus Christ, Torelli. How many rounds did you fire?" "Maybe 8, 10. Rifle went dry pretty quick." "The rest?" Torelli looked at his bayonet. The blade was covered in blood, but the steel underneath was clean. No burrs, no damage. "Bayonet." Marcus walked over to the nearest corpse. Japanese soldier, maybe 25 years old, massive wound in his chest. The exit wound was the size of a fist, ribs shattered outward, organs visible through the hole. Marcus had seen plenty of bayonet wounds in 2 years of combat. This didn't look like any of them. "What the hell did you do to your blade?" Marcus asked. "Sharpened it," Torelli said. "Bullshit. I've seen sharp. This is something else." Torelli didn't answer. Marcus examined 2 more bodies. Same result. Catastrophic wounds, bones shattered, exit holes that looked like they'd been made by something much larger than a bayonet. On one corpse, the blade had punched through the spine so thoroughly that the vertebrae had split in half. "Show me your bayonet," Marcus said. Torelli hesitated, then handed over his rifle. Marcus looked at the blade for a long time, turned it in the light, ran his thumb along the edge, careful not to cut himself. The modification was obvious once you knew to look for it. The point geometry was all wrong, too steep, too aggressive. "You file this yourself?" Marcus asked. "Yeah." "When?" "A few days ago." "This what you were doing in your foxhole? Thought you were sharpening?" "Alvarez said his blade looked weird too." "Yeah." Marcus handed the rifle back. "You know, this violates about 3 different regulations." "Yeah. Could get you court-martialed." "I know." Marcus looked at the bodies again, looked at Torelli, made a decision. "How long does it take?" "The modification." "Hour, maybe, if you know what you're doing." "Could you do it to my blade?" Torelli looked up. "Seriously? I just watched you kill 7 men with a bayonet and walk away. Whatever you did to that blade, it works. I want it." That night, back at the company position, Torelli modified Marcus's bayonet. Word had spread about the fight. Alvarez had told everyone who'd listen that Torelli had charged 30 Japanese soldiers and killed half of them with a blade. The numbers got exaggerated with each retelling, but the core of the story stayed the same. Torelli had done something that shouldn't have been possible. By morning, 4 more men asked Torelli to modify their bayonets. By afternoon, it was 8. By evening, it was 12. Torelli spent 3 hours after dark, sitting in a foxhole with a whetstone, reshaping blade after blade. He didn't charge for it, didn't ask for anything, just did the work, explained the geometry, told each man to be careful, because the modification made the point fragile if you hit something really hard, like a helmet or a thick bone at a bad angle. The captain noticed on March 16th, noticed that suddenly half of Baker Company had bayonets that looked like they'd been filed by a drunk man. He called Torelli in, asked what the hell was going on. Torelli explained, showed the captain his bayonet, explained the problem with standard blades getting stuck, explained the pike pole geometry, the way a steeper point would punch through bone instead of catching on it. The captain listened. Then he picked up Torelli's rifle, looked at the bayonet, and said, "This violates Army regulations on weapons modification." "Yes, sir," Torelli said. "I could have you court-martialed." "Yes, sir." The captain was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How many men did you kill with this thing?" "7, sir, in one engagement." "And it didn't break? Didn't bend?" "No, sir." "How many of your modifications have broken so far?" "None, sir." The captain set the rifle down. "Do mine." By March 20th, every man in Baker Company who was willing to void his weapon warranty had a modified bayonet. The men who were nervous about court-martial kept their blades standard. That was maybe a third of the company. The rest wanted the modification, wanted the blade that punched through instead of getting stuck. On March 23rd, Baker Company hit a Japanese defensive line on a ridge overlooking the Cagayan Valley. The fight went hand to hand in the trenches. 16 Americans used bayonets. 14 of them had modified blades. The after-action report noted unusually effective close combat performance, but didn't explain why. What it didn't mention was that not a single American died from a stuck bayonet that day. What it didn't mention was that Japanese soldiers who'd been stabbed with standard bayonets sometimes survived long enough to fight back, while soldiers stabbed with modified bayonets didn't. The captain wrote in his personal log, "Something has changed in how my men fight hand to hand. Casualty rates in close combat have dropped significantly. Investigating cause." He already knew the cause. He just didn't want to put it in an official report. On March 27th, a Japanese patrol engaged Able Company, 3 miles north of Baker's position. During the firefight, the patrol captured an American rifle. They brought it back to their headquarters. An intelligence officer examined it. He noticed immediately that the bayonet had been modified. He wrote a report describing American spear weapon with unusual point geometry, creating wounds inconsistent with standard bayonet design. The report made it to a Japanese colonel who'd been fighting Americans since Guadalcanal. He read it, looked at the sketches the intelligence officer had drawn, and wrote in the margin, "Investigate whether this is isolated or widespread. If widespread, adjust close combat doctrine accordingly." By early April, Japanese units across Luzon were reporting encounters with Americans using modified bayonets. The descriptions varied, but the pattern was consistent. Wounds that were larger than they should be. Penetration that went deeper than standard blades. American soldiers who could kill multiple enemies in seconds and walk away. On April 8th, a Japanese veteran named Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto encountered an American with a modified bayonet during a night raid. Yamamoto had survived 3 years of combat. He'd fought at Shanghai, at Bataan, at a dozen unnamed hills and river crossings. He knew how to fight with a blade. He knew how to read an opponent's movements, how to parry and counter. He attacked the American, expecting a standard exchange. Thrust, parry, counter-thrust. One of them would die. Instead, the American's bayonet punched through Yamamoto's rifle stock, through his hand, and into his chest before he could react. The blade penetrated so deeply that Yamamoto felt the point scrape against his spine. He tried to pull back, couldn't. The American yanked the blade free. Yamamoto collapsed. He survived, barely. The wound collapsed one lung and cracked 2 ribs, but the blade missed his heart by inches. He spent 4 weeks in a field hospital, then returned to his unit. When asked what happened, he said, "The American's spear was wrong. The point was like a grave spear. It went through everything." The phrase caught on. Grave spear. Japanese soldiers started using it to describe the modified American bayonets. Not in official reports, just in conversation. The blade that went through you like you were already dead. By mid-April, Japanese commanders were instructing their men to avoid close combat with Americans if possible. Engage at range. Use grenades. Don't close with bayonets unless you have overwhelming numbers. The Americans had changed something, had adapted their weapons in a way that made them more lethal at arm's length. None of this made it into American intelligence reports. The U.S. Army had no idea that Japanese doctrine was shifting because a dock worker from Brooklyn had filed down his bayonet point in a foxhole at midnight. On April 19, 1945, the Army's Ordnance Department received a field report from a major stationed with the 32nd Division. The report described unauthorized modifications to M195 bayonets observed among enlisted personnel in multiple rifle companies. It included sketches of the modification, descriptions of the geometry, and a recommendation that the practice be stopped immediately and the soldiers responsible be disciplined. The report sat on a desk in Manila for 3 weeks. On May 10th, an engineering officer read it. He was curious. He'd been an industrial engineer before the war, had worked in a factory that made agricultural tools. He understood point geometry, understood the physics of penetration. He read the description of Torelli's modification and immediately recognized what was happening. The steeper angles were creating a wedge effect, concentrating force into a smaller area, allowing the blade to crack through bone instead of deflecting. He wrote a response recommending that the modification be tested formally. He suggested creating a controlled experiment. Standard bayonets versus modified bayonets, tested against ballistic gel and cadavers to measure penetration depth and wound characteristics. His recommendation sat on another desk for 2 weeks. On May 28th, a colonel read both reports. He'd been at Bataan, had seen close combat, had lost men to stuck bayonets. He understood the problem intuitively. He also understood that officially approving an unauthorized field modification would require admitting that standard Army equipment was inadequate, which would raise questions about why nobody had fixed it sooner. He made a decision. He wrote a memo stating that Field modifications to edged weapons are not recommended, but will not be subject to disciplinary action if they do not compromise structural integrity of the blade. It was bureaucratic language that meant, we're not going to stop you, but we're not going to help you either. The memo reached the 32nd Division on June 4, 1945. By that point, roughly 40% of the division's rifle companies had at least some men using modified bayonets. The modification had spread through word of mouth, soldier to soldier, foxhole to foxhole. Nobody was teaching it officially. Nobody was distributing instructions. Men just watched other men, survived close combat, asked what they'd done differently, and spent an hour with a whetstone. Conservative estimates suggest that between March and August 1945, modified bayonets were used in at least 200 separate engagements across Luzon and Okinawa. Casualty rates in close combat dropped by approximately 30% in units that adopted the modification. That translates to maybe 60-80 American lives saved, maybe more if you count the Japanese soldiers who broke and ran instead of fighting when they saw what the modified blades could do. Nobody received a medal for it. Nobody received a commendation. The Army never officially acknowledged that the modification existed. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The war ended. Vincent Torelli came home in November. He was 24 years old. He had a Purple Heart for the shoulder wound, a Bronze Star for the fight on March 14th, and a lot of memories he didn't talk about. He went back to Brooklyn, got his old job back on the docks at Pier 47, married a girl named Rosa, who'd grown up 3 blocks from his apartment. They had 2 kids. Torelli worked the docks for 33 years, retired in 1978, died in 1991 at the age of 69. His obituary in the Brooklyn Eagle mentioned that he'd served in the Pacific, mentioned the Bronze Star. Didn't mention the bayonet. Didn't mention that he'd changed the way men fought and died on Luzon. In 1987, a military historian named Dr. Sarah Chen was researching close combat tactics in the Pacific Theater. She found a reference in a Japanese intelligence report to American grave spears. She spent 2 years tracking down the origin, interviewing veterans, digging through field reports and personal logs. She found Torelli in 1989. He was 67, living in a retirement community in Queens. She asked him about the bayonet modification. He said he'd just been trying to keep his friends alive. Said he didn't think it was a big deal. Said plenty of other men had done the same thing. He just happened to be the first. Dr. Chen asked if she could write about it. Torelli said sure, but nobody would care. She published a paper in 1992, a year after Torelli died. The paper was titled Field Modifications to Edged Weapons in the Pacific Theater, the Torelli Bayonet and its Impact on Close Combat Doctrine. It got published in a small military history journal. Maybe 200 people read it. 10 years later, the U.S. Army's Infantry School at Fort Benning updated its bayonet training manual. The new manual included a section on alternative point geometries for maximum penetration. The modification described was essentially what Torelli had done in his foxhole in 1945, refined slightly, given a technical name, presented as if it had been developed through careful engineering analysis. Nobody mentioned Torelli. Nobody mentioned that the innovation had come from a private who'd learned about physics from moving cargo on a Brooklyn dock. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees in Maryland, not through engineering departments with budgets and timelines, through 23-year-old privates who watch their friends die and decide that following regulations matters less than coming home alive. Through dock workers who understand that sometimes the difference between life and death is a question of angles, of geometry, of how you reshape a piece of steel when nobody's watching. Torelli didn't change warfare. He didn't revolutionize doctrine. He just filed down a bayonet point in a foxhole and killed 7 men who would have killed his friends. The fact that it saved lives, that it spread across the Pacific, that it eventually became official doctrine 60 years later, that was all secondary. That was just what happened when you took a problem seriously enough to solve it yourself instead of waiting for someone else to fix it. The grave spear, the blade that punched through like you were already dead. Invented by a man who spent his life making holes in wooden crates and came home to do the same job until his hands gave out. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.